How is it possible that a champion car designed to dominate modern Formula One was just 2/10 away from being eliminated in Q1 and hours before fighting for pole? Because what McLaren experienced in the Miami 2026 qualifying with Oscar Piastri was not a simple driving error. It was a failure so unexpected, so complex and so difficult to explain that it left its own engineers completely shocked. A hidden problem in the MCL40 linked to the new hybrid era, which completely changed the behavior of the car at the most critical moment of the weekend, and which could explain why the most dominant team in recent years suddenly no longer understands its own machine. When they arrive in Miami, the team introduces a package of updates with the intention of correcting precisely those inconsistencies. The internal expectation was clear: stabilize the car's behavior in qualifying, improve the operating window and return the MCL40 to a logical position at the top of the grid. During the first sessions, it seemed that this objective was being met. And then the first blow of reality occurs, but disguised as success. In the sprint classification, the car responds. Piastri places himself in front positions, the rhythm appears, the car transmits confidence. On the wall, the engineers begin to validate their hypotheses, to believe that they have finally found the right path. Everything fits, everything seems to make sense. But hours later, at the most important moment, everything collapses. The main classification exposes a completely opposite version of the same car. Piastri enters Q1 and from the first attempt it is clear that something is not working. There is no rhythm, there is no consistency, there is no ability to improve. Each sector reflects inexplicable losses of time and what is worse, the pilot cannot clearly identify what is failing from the cockpit. That brutal contrast between two practically consecutive sessions is what generates the real shock within McLaren, because it eliminates any simple explanation. It's not about traffic, it's not about tires, it's not about a one-time mistake. It is something structural, something that changes the behavior of the car radically without warning. And this is where the role of engineers becomes critical. During these hours, the computer enters a state of total analysis. Telemetries, energy maps, lap comparison, correlation with simulator. Everything is reviewed. And the deeper they dig, the more disturbing the conclusion becomes. The car isn't failing in a traditional way, it's operating outside its optimal window without a clear transition. This means that the MCL40 does not warn when it is stopping performing. It just falls. For a driver like Piastri, this is devastating, because it eliminates any ability to adapt during the return. There are no progressive signs, there is no room for correction. The car may feel relatively normal until, at a critical point in the circuit, it abruptly loses performance. And for engineers, this is even worse, because it implies that the model they are working with, whether in a simulator, historical data, or aerodynamic correlation, is not correctly capturing the reality of the car on the track. That is, they are making decisions based on information that does not faithfully represent what is happening. Miami doesn't just expose a performance problem. It exposes a disconnect between the real car and the team's understanding of it. And at that moment, inside the McLaren garage, a sensation appears that no team wants to experience: doubt. Doubt about the car, doubt about the data, and above all, doubt about whether they are really understanding the challenge posed by the new era of Formula One. Because what happened to Piastri was not an isolated incident, it was the first clear evidence that something much deeper was out of control. The breaking point in this whole case comes when McLaren stops wondering what happened, and begins to understand why it happened. Because what initially seemed like an anomaly between sessions, in reality hid one of the most complex and least understood consequences of the 2026 regulation: extreme energy management and its direct impact on qualifying performance. This is where the concept that changes everything comes in, the famous super clipping. In the new hybrid era, cars not only depend on the combustion engine and aerodynamics, but on how they distribute and recover electrical energy throughout the lap. And what McLaren engineers discovered after analyzing what happened with Oscar Piastri is that the MCL40 was entering a critical phase of energy management right at the most sensitive points of the circuit. Super clipping, in simple terms, occurs when the hybrid system begins to recover energy at times when it should be delivering power. That is, the car stops pushing when you need it most. But what is really dangerous is not the concept itself, but how it manifests itself on the track. Because it is not something constant. It's not a uniform loss that you can anticipate. It is an intermittent, strategic cut, but brutal in its consequences. In Piastri's case, what the data shows is that during his Q1 lap, the car was draining energy in areas where the driver expected maximum acceleration. This generated time losses that were invisible from the cockpit, but devastating on the stopwatch. And this is where the problem becomes even more critical. The MCL40 had no margin to absorb this type of loss. Unlike other teams that had managed to design cars with wider performance windows, McLaren had built a car that was extremely efficient, but also extremely fragile in its balance. That means that any imbalance in energy management not only affected part of the lap, but completely broke the coherence of performance. It is as if the entire system is connected by an extremely fine thread. If one part fails, the whole thing falls apart. The engineers then begin to reconstruct lap by lap, sector by sector, comparing the sprint classification with the main classification. And what they find is disturbing. There is no clear mechanical difference, there are no radical changes in the configuration, there are no obvious errors in tires. The difference is in how the car managed the energy. And that changes absolutely everything. Because it implies that performance no longer depends only on traditional tuning, but on a millimetric choreography between pilot, software, and hybrid system. If that timing isn't perfect, the car simply stops being competitive. This explains why Piastri could not feel the problem clearly. From his perspective, the car was not obviously failing. There was no extreme oversteer, there were no stalls, there were no visible errors. But time didn't work out. And that is the most dangerous thing in Formula One. A problem that is not felt, but that destroys your return. Faced with this situation, even the FIA had to intervene with specific adjustments for the classification in Miami, modifying the energy recovery limits and the power of the system to try to balance the behavior of the cars. But for McLaren, the damage had already been done. Because beyond the regulatory changes, the team had discovered a fundamental weakness in its concept. The MCL40 was not simply difficult to adjust. And this is where everything that happened in Miami stops being a simple technical problem and becomes a direct threat to McLaren's future in the 2026 season. Because once engineers understand that the failure is not punctual but structural, the concern within the team completely changes dimension. It is no longer about optimizing the car for the next session, or even for the next Grand Prix. It is about accepting that the MCL40 has a basic limitation that can affect the entire year. The first consequence is immediate, the loss of trust. Not only from the driver to the car, but from the team to their own tools. Because when a car behaves unpredictably, when it does not respond coherently to adjustments, the entire development process goes into crisis. Each change stops being a sure improvement and becomes an experiment with uncertain results. For Oscar Piastri, this has a direct impact on his driving style. Up to this point, he had built his performance on the ability to push the car to its limits, to understand its reactions and adapt to them. But with the MCL40 in these conditions, that approach is no longer viable. He can no longer trust the car to give him what he demands. And in Formula One, when a driver loses that confidence, he loses tenths. And those tenths are everything. But the hardest blow is not on the track, but in the team's internal planning. Because McLaren faces a critical decision. Try to correct this behavior with evolutions during the season, or accept that the concept has limitations and start thinking about 2027. That is the true consequence of what happened in Miami. Because in modern Formula One, the margin to react is minimal. Every lost race not only means points that don't come back, but also fewer opportunities to test solutions in real conditions. And when the problem is linked to something as complex as energy management, each solution attempt requires validation, correlation, and, above all, risk. Miami then marks a before and after. Not because of the result itself, but because of what it reveals. That McLaren is no longer in full control of its performance. And that, in a sport where control is everything, completely changes the narrative. From this moment on, every qualifying session, every run, every adjustment becomes a mystery. Will the car work like it did in the sprint? Or will it collapse again like it did in Q1? That doubt is the real enemy. Because as long as it exists, the team will not be able to operate with the aggressiveness and precision that characterized it. And without that, staying on top becomes virtually impossible. What started as a strange classification with Oscar Piastri ends up being a warning sign that can define McLaren's destiny in the entire 2026 era. And the big question that remains in the air is as simple as it is disturbing. Can they solve it before it's too late? And in the end, everything that happened with Oscar Piastri in the Miami 2026 qualification leaves a much deeper conclusion than it seems at first glance. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't bad luck. It was a warning. A warning that Formula One has changed more than even the most prepared teams were ready to accept. Because what McLaren discovered that weekend is that it is no longer enough to have the best car in terms of aerodynamics or the most efficient package. Now everything depends on something much more delicate, much more invisible and much more difficult to control. Perfect energy management. Miami exposed an uncomfortable truth. The MCL40 is not a slow car, but it is an unforgiving car. A car that demands absolute precision in an environment where every variable constantly changes. And in that scenario, even a driver of Piastri's level, even a team of McLaren's level, can find themselves completely overwhelmed by a system that they do not master 100%. That's why the engineers were shocked, because they understood that the problem was not in what they saw, but in what they could not control. And that's what makes this case so important going forward. Because if McLaren fails to extend that window of operation, if it fails to stabilize the interaction between the car and the hybrid system, each classification will continue to be a roulette. One day they could be fighting for pole, and the next on the brink of elimination. That extreme. So fragile. So unpredictable. And in a championship where consistency is everything, that's a risk that can cost you a title. What happened in Miami doesn't just define a weekend, it defines the challenge that McLaren has ahead of it. A technical, strategic, and mental challenge that goes far beyond finding a few tenths. Because now the question is no longer whether the car is fast. The real question is whether they can figure it out before their rivals do it better. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.